Hi, hello everyone. I thought what I'd do is present a brief lecture, which gives a sort of an overview of Heidegger's philosophy, given also that I think this year is his 50th, um, not anniversary, but the 50th year of his death. And I am going to go over what I take to be the most important moments of the Denkweg, as he referred to himself, the thinking path. And we have to begin, of course, with being in time. And before I do so, may I just perhaps remind everyone that if you'd like to read Heidegger with some guidance from me, then there's a um, course bundle which brings together 4 courses on Heidegger that I've published over the last 6 years. So I think I might begin, though, with a bit of a reference to just my own book, perhaps, on Heidegger on Death and Being, which has the subtitle An Answer to the Seinsfrage, an answer to the question of being, which I think we find if we just let Heidegger's philosophy speak for itself without applying any sort of frameworks or similar. As a recent reviewer also pointed out, I think the book was reviewed in the Heidegger studies last year, and the reviewer, I think, was really good review. He did see what I attempt to do, which is simply to let Heidegger's philosophy speak for itself and not put it in any sort of framework. And what you find, the more of Heidegger you read, is that death is the core, really, of his philosophy. Death is the, if you like, the fulcrum of his ontology, and death does not disappear after being in time, after the so-called analytic of Dasein. So, if Heidegger is not an existentialist, but we even if you would, if you want to see him as an existentialist, he doesn't just death does not disappear. It's quite the opposite. Death actually takes on a more prominent place, even in the so-called later Heidegger. Now, I'll say a few words perhaps to begin with on Heidegger 1 and Heidegger 2, which is a distinction that was drawn by Father William Richardson and was then mindlessly, of course, as academics are wont to do, basically accepted by generations of academics ever since. Now, this is also something I address in the book, which, if you haven't got a copy of it yet, maybe try and get one, published by Springer. If you're a student somewhere, you should be able to get a copy through your library. If you haven't got it in your library yet, wherever you study, just order it. You can get, if it's not available, just go on your library website and make sure that there's a couple of copies in your student library, in your university library. So, because I think it's still quite expensive, unfortunately, to buy a copy for yourself. By the way, no royalties paid to the author at all. So that's academic publishing for you. Now, Father Richardson, I have not read anything that he wrote on Heidegger, but what I did read was Heidegger's letter to Father Richardson, in which Heidegger explicitly addresses, which you can read this letter. It's available, of course, in German, but also in English and other languages. Where Heidegger does address this distinction that Richardson draws, this very representational distinction. Where there's Heidegger 1, then there's the break, the turn, and there's Heidegger 2, and they've got nothing to say to each other. And Heidegger explicitly says there is not one without the other. If there is no Heidegger 2 without Heidegger 1, if even you want to use these sort of silly rubrics, and he also points out that when we hear the title Being and Time, what we have to hear is being is presence and time is self-concealment. And that is what we have to do from the very beginning. Heidegger is not an existentialist. Again, he ties his entire project from the beginning, where's being in time? It's here, to the question of being, which is what, as he points out, the question that keeps Plato and Aristotle's thinking alive and unsettled from the very beginning. And so the first quote in this book is from Plato's sophist, Delongar. It seems to be obvious what we mean by the word being, but it's not obvious. And Heidegger picks up on this. He picks up on something the tradition was never fully aware of, which is not to say that no one addressed being before. That's silly to assume this. No, they did. But that it is an issue and has been an issue and is not so simply, cannot be so simply answered. That's the issue from the beginning. And so Heidegger lays out the analytic of Dasein insofar as for Dasein is the being for which its being is an issue. So Dasein, the horizon in which the human being participates, has an opening or is an opening to being. And so from the beginning also, which something I point out in my book actually, and also in my course on being in time, is that while there is a sort of, you could say, a forgetting of being, there is also maybe even more so a forgetting of or oblivion of time. Heidegger understands being from the beginning as Anwesen, as presence. Nothing wrong with presence. Don't be a Derridean and think that Heidegger is opposed to presence. That's not the case. Instead, what he aims to do is to show that if you want to think presence, the presence of beings, and hence that's the ontological difference also, being and beings, presence of that which is present, the way in which they are present, that you can only think and approach in terms of time. And hence all hinges on how we think time. If we think time only as fleeting and passing, as linear, as it were, then this is also, as he points out, the end of being in time. This is because of our fleeting knowledge of death, of our death. So from the beginning, as I said before, death is at the center. And what I address in my book, but also in the course on Heidegger on death and being, is exactly that, that from the beginning, Heidegger's question of being, Heidegger's question after being, can only be asked because we can only ask the question so far as we're mortal, mortally finite, bound by the utmost possibility that is death, and at the same time, that which gives free, which releases all other possibilities to Dasein, is Dasein's death. And it is the moment where being in time moves after the analytic or diagnosis of aletheia as unconcealment, moves over to section 2, division 2, and the analytic of death. I think it's there that Heidegger really comes into his own in terms of thinking and ignites as a thinker and also realizes something, which is that being inherently withdraws. Being inherently withdraws. In this moment, that's where Heidegger comes into. That's where he leaves behind, quote unquote, phenomenology, all sorts of perhaps remnants of transcendental idealism, etc., anything that can be read into it. And this is then actually, which I also address in the book, and in the course on Heidegger on death and being, which is radicalized further in his lecture course on Plato and truth, das Wesen der Wahrheit, and his reading of the cave myth, the way in which Heidegger addresses the cave myth. So I'd like to then point out that what I what happens, I say, along the thinking path. Maybe there's one text to mention just briefly, which is often mentioned too. Anyone who's just joining now, um, yeah. So there's a course bundle, by the way, 4 courses on Heidegger, plus a bonus one, a 5th course on leisure, which includes an extensive lecture on Heidegger's notion of Gelassenheit. So with this bundle of courses, you should be able to really get on the thinking path and make your way through it. So where was I? The moment in which he ignites again is the analytic of death, together with Aletheia, which is radicalized further in his lecture course on the essence of truth on Plato in the, I think, 1930, maybe 1929, I don't know. In between, he gives an extensive lecture course on the title of the course is Fundamental Concept of Metaphysics. It's got nothing to do with that. He just used those titles because there was this is how teaching was so different. You were supposed to you're supposed to teach a fundamental concept of metaphysics, and you're just free to do whatever you like. I mean, try doing this today at any university. Students will give you a bad evaluation, and you get fired straight away. So in it, he talks about boredom and world, etc. But in it, he also says, importantly, that Dasein is not a human being. So don't think of Dasein and Daseins. Your Dasein is the being of the human being. That's to say, that's what we participate in. And it's not, as Heidegger, I think, says, I never envisioned, I don't envision a Dasein running around in the street, taking the streetcar, or using fork and knife to eat. So don't reify Dasein. Try and think it always in actu and acting itself and its possibilities. So after, and there's of course, Heidegger continues to give various lecture courses. I won't trace all of them here, but with the lecture course on the essence of truth, and of course also Introduction to Metaphysics, which is, I think, 1935 or so, in which he addresses tragic existence and also his turn to Nietzsche in his more so-called, if you like, esoteric writings, or at least only posthumously published writings, one of them being published as Contributions to Philosophy. Heidegger develops a very different way of thinking in which he tries to address the eventuating character. It tries to think the Ereignis. Now, I just said eventuating as sort of a crutch. That there's a certain notion of oscillation and of movement, etc. But I don't think that we should translate the Ereignis just simply as the event. It goes a bit further because he does refer to the Ereignis in the contributions actually as a realm, as perhaps we could say the realm of realms. And he also says explicitly in his essay on the principle of identity that, and I think the translator Stambau, or whatever her name was, I think she was a translator back then, she conveniently leaves out that entire passage, in which Heidegger says the following: fundamental words such as logos and Tao, the Tao, and Ereignis cannot be translated. Leaves that out and just says, I think, event, or essential event, or some nonsense to that effect. But in this essay, Heidegger also says, let's forget about the translator. In this essay, he also says that the Ereignis is the realm in which the human being and the human being encounter each other. And so the Ereignis is always, always. So someone's asking, would you offer a course on the Beiträge? Well, this course on death and being has a substantial lecture on the contributions. And so does my book also contain a substantial part on the contributions, which is crucial because nothing will make sense. Neither his writings on technology nor on poetry and language make any sense if you haven't read at least some parts of the contributions, the so-called the Beiträge on the Ereignis. So yes, there is a course on the contributions, is the course Heidegger on death and being. And so what the course bundle actually does, it begins with being and time, then moves on to Heidegger on death and being, which is the entirety of Heidegger's philosophy, tracing the thinking path, and then moves on into technology, poetry, and framing, and the fourfold. Again, none of which make any sense to any reader. If you read the question concerning technology, you will not know really what Heidegger is after without having read at least some parts of the contributions, which I address in the course on Heidegger on death and being. So make sure to check that out. Anyways, now back to more important matters. The notion of Ereignis, again, is the realm of realms, if you like, in which being and human beings always already encounter each other. I also point out in the book, as well as in the courses, that Heidegger refers to Ereignis as has a double meaning: coming into its own, disappearing at the same time, coming into its own, disappearing at the same time, at once. Not one after the other, not dialectical anywhere, at once. There's no coming into its own without disappearing. And at the same time, however, he also hears in the eigen, not just proprium, owning, but also eugen, to I. And if you've read my book, for example, on Aristotle's eudaimonia, maybe you've heard some lectures on here, you'll have heard me speak about theoria as this field of vision in which the human being is addressed. So the Ereignis is that which looks at. And there's also a video lecture on here on the channel on Heidegger and the eyes of the gods, which addresses this further. So, and in some sense, there's complete unpredictability. There's complete unpredictability in the Ereignis. You cannot just, as good old Spengler and other reactionaries do, look at a tree, as Spengler does, and say, "Oh, look, that tree is growing, and now it's old, and now it's decaying. And so let me just use this very simplistic pattern and claim that civilizations and cultures work the same way. And we can find these cycles everywhere, and they just repeat perfectly all over again, which is rather simplistic metaphysics. So no, the Ereignis means that history is unpredictable. Unpredictable. You cannot you can, well, as Heidegger points out in the Black Notebooks, I have to be careful, but he says, you can do prophecy, and then you can basically engage in self-fulfilling prophecy, but you cannot. But even that is not necessarily to pan out in the manner that the so-called prophets, which Heidegger does not believe exist for real, actually enact any of it, because the Ereignis again is unpredictable. There is in any discovery, if you like, there is withdrawal, concealment, disappearance, inevitably so. Hence, there cannot either be perfect control. Just as a side note. And so once we step out of, perhaps again, the contributions to philosophy, what we find on the other end is Heidegger, beginning in the 1950s, to engage publicly with technology, technique, or techniques, we should perhaps say, and with poetry, poetic language. Now, all this talk about the turn, just to address this again, is to do with an assumption that there's a clear cut. Heidegger gives up on the project of being in time and simply turns to other things. No. Heidegger continues the project of being in time by decentering Dasein, which he had to address, as I point out in the book, to dethrone subjectivity. And he now turns to being as such, and more so. Dasein doesn't disappear, however. Dasein is now even further, if you like, radicalized as the site of history. Remember, Heidegger does not ask, what is Dasein? But, now those of you who can hear, who is Dasein? Who? And who, that means, for example, that Dasein is, in some sense, of course, always already historical. It's a certain group, for example, that's Dasein, different groups. And that is, Dasein plays out and is in that sense the site for being, for the history of being to play out in a different way. So Heidegger is acutely aware after the war, and of course, all sorts of efforts of universalizing the world, homogenizing the world, and bringing about perfect monotheism, which, you should be aware that modernity is not the falling off of the one true God. It is, in fact, actually the fulfillment, the completion, you could almost say, of a crude, let's say, monotheism. And so Heidegger engages in intercultural, if you like, dialogue, always acutely aware of the trap that Europeans also want to fall into, which is to be Eurocentric. Heidegger is not, and thus he is more open to others. Herder, by the way, wasn't either before him. And at least in that regard, Heidegger stands in the historicist tradition that begins with Herder. And so we see after the war and after his basically private writings on the Ereignis, we see him turn to the Ereignis publicly in essays such as on the principle of identity, or the leap of identity, der Satz der Identität. We see him address the Ereignis in die Frage nach der Technik, in the question concerning technology. So, how so? In the question concerning technology, for example, we learn that in framing, or das Wesen der Technik, the realm of technics, is Gestell, that which concentrates and gathers all modes of positioning and challenging forth. And that is the prevalent, but not only, dimension of being in this epoch. And so the attempt that Heidegger, the fact that Heidegger can see Gestell, rather, is already owed to his seeing Seinsgeschichte, which is not the arbitrary history of being as it's translated, of different ways of interpreting being, which we can so neatly package and pigeonhole. No, it's being unfolding as its own tidal waves, There are tidings of being that sometimes we hear and sometimes not. And there's never only one dimension of being at stake. Now, the homogenization, the Gleichschaltung, the universalization through techniques in this epoch, of course, bears the threat of homogenizing, reducing, if you like, world access to such an extent that it truly becomes, at least abstractly speaking, one dimensional. Um, and hence, Heidegger's turn also to language as a dimension in which the human being is addressed and spoken. Language, in a sense, as he says, more or less, we could say Heidegger would subscribe to this, speaks us. And so, speaking in a different language, um, yeah, there's a discussion here on space. I'm afraid that uh, space is very important in Heidegger. I don't know why you would make up that space doesn't matter. Um, I would end the discussion here, to be honest. If you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. And no, abstract thought does not need space, except if you just cannot abstract from your own body being in a space. Thought is by definition spaceless. That's a different discussion. So, yeah, there's something that anyone should bring to any big philosopher is, if you haven't read anything, maybe just be quiet, uh, and don't even try to engage with it. That's really a good advice. I think if you because there's this tendency I find with so many now, which is to leap to conclusions and make things up. Just don't assault philosophy. If you don't know what you're talking about, leave leave philosophy. Really, you should leave. Because it takes years and years and years to get to a level where you can maybe say that maybe you see something, and I might maybe just be right around there. But if you don't, then it's better just to leave. Especially this place here, you should just leave. I'm serious. If I see more of this, I will just block you. Um, and so the next, the moment in which Heidegger turns uh, to to language isn't arbitrary. What he sees is that language is technically that there's a certain technical language that's taking over. A language that I speak in English now too, which is becoming the quote unquote lingua franca of the world. It's a dumbed down version, of course, of English. Uh, an uprooted English, an English that doesn't have anything really to do with anywhere, um, and communication. The communication of information is really what is perhaps the most violent way in which techniques reinforces itself. The assumption that anything can be translated into any other language. The assumption that you can just look up something on the internet very quickly and you already know what's going on. Oh, what's Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same? Oh, let me just look this up on Wikipedia. Or of course, for the more stupid ones out there, just go on the ChatGPT and get the answer immediately vomited back at you. It vomits it at, I need to have information vomited at me. That's what you're doing basically when you just quickly ask Wikipedia or ChatGPT, which is just Wikipedia on steroids. And so if you and this sort of this is the destructive movement, automated non-thinking. uh, there's always a bit of a delay in these live streams. So when I say something, I think it arrives out in the world about 20, 30, 40 seconds later. And so I'm always pleased to see that in certain moments, viewership drops, which is always good to see because it means that I've lost those who I need to lose, who need to go. And I'm very serious about this. In this time in which everything seems to be for everyone, we need to remember that no, most things that are good and true and difficult are not for most. Heidegger is very explicit about this. It's for the few and the rare. Um, no, space is a form of intuition. Yeah, you've not read Kant. I'm sorry. So the fact is that technology, through communication of informational values, homogenizes. And this is what I think Heidegger sees, and it does so by the use of propositional linguistics. I mean, linguistics, the analytic philosophy of language, etc. All of this is connected to to the destruction of the earth, if you like. It's not so much the nuclear bomb; it's analytic philosophy, and it's Wittgenstein. If you are you should just leave also if you want to read Wittgenstein into Heidegger. And so Heidegger's turn not only to poetry, and of specific poetry, not just any poetry, Hölderlin, crucially, and of course also to dialect, to the German word is Mundart, to the way in which the mouth is shaped and grown because of the landscape. So the earth forms our mouth, and thus we speak. We speak in different ways. He, I mean, I know that there's movie American and movie German, but those are fake accents. They're not proper language. So Heidegger turns explicitly to dialect later on in his life and to what we can still unearth from dialect. Because it is in dialects that he sees still an access to the rootedness which the technicization of the planet on a planetary scale wants to crowd out. And his last written note of a few months, I think, before he died, I have it somewhere here in the book. Heidegger points out that let me try and find it. It's been a while that I looked at my own book. So I think a few months before he died, Heidegger points out in a note that was then he didn't read it himself; it was read by someone else in his hometown, that he fears that the machine world, the technicized world, will no longer allow a home in the future for the human being, for human dwelling. And so we find in Heidegger always that attempt, and I think also to a large extent achievement, of beginning with experience in thinking, which of course, for once could relate to, or could come from thought or thinking that addresses us in a moment in which we begin to listen to our language again. But for that, it has to be our language. You see, if God forbid, the whole planet at some point speaks a dumbed down version of English, it's that's not language anymore. That's simply a means of communication. If if in a nation state language gets so homogenized, as for example happened in France, the centralization of the language, etc., uh, then even here you would have to wonder whether that's still proper language. To Heidegger, it, clearly language is not, as anyone can gather, a grouping together of words. Um, yes, okay, this is very good here. Thank you. So this person says, Bumbi or Bumbi, 1, 2, 3, just came across another of these news sites which translate every news source from anywhere from the world for each individual to understand everything what is going on everywhere. Yes. So this is the geopolitical subject, as I've called it, um, that we apparently all have to be. So we have to be informed as a specific, a grounded, formed and informed. It's just information. You are informed. You're basically enframed. If you want to use a different word, we are being enframed by information. And of course, in order to be able to translate everything, we have to disambiguate everything. So every single word has to have a specific meaning. Now, if you are lucky enough to have been born and raised in an area of the world where there's still proper dialect being spoken, not just an accent, but a certain dialect being spoken, you will know that there are ways you can't even translate certain expressions. Let's say you're born in Bavaria or maybe some region in southern Italy. You can't even translate that into um, quote unquote normal, what's considered normal Italian or German. And also that there's a certain ambiguity about words. And those of you old enough to remember when Wikipedia was really not big, which is 15 years ago, when it was still prohibited to use Wikipedia, for example, as a source at university, Wikipedia had one of its major projects is, of course, to disambiguate. So to make sure that every single term, every single word is perfectly defined. Now, Ossip Mandelstam, who I also quote in the book, says in his conversations on Dante that every word is a bundle of rays, and Sonnenstrahl, I think, is the German translation of the Russian. And that's how we perhaps should begin to think of language again. But the time is a different one. As I said before, if you're happy to have information vomited back at you because that's all you look for is quick information, then you are perfectly content with the completely and totally homogenized informational world, which is the recession of world. There's no world in it. There can't be. Because world means that there's a resistance in the arising of that very horizon. The informational package is different. It's a completely inframed non-space, non-place, which always already enframes everything according to the subject's demands. Think of what you do when you travel. Do you let the place attack you? Or do you attack the place that you go to? And that attack could just be that you have ChatGPT spit out some itinerary for you and what to do, the most important things to see in Naples. And so the places begin to change. The places only cater now to the international hordes of tourists, which are completely replaceable. Doesn't matter whether they're Chinese or American or German or Russian or whatever. All the same. So this homogenization is how what Heidegger sees. But at the same time, of course, we would have to say also that as this in this extreme, this is what Gestell is ultimately. This extreme form of Gestell of framing is at the same time already inviting not its opposite, but it's flipping over from within. It's overturning. It's getting over. So one important notion for Heidegger is verwinden, not überwinden, but verwinden. Maybe put this in the chat. So this one here, verwinden, which means to get over, perhaps to overturn, to turn over from within. And that I would point out to you is the crucial notion to keep in mind. You would need to try and think through what Heidegger has to say on technology, on poetry, etc. Always in terms of Ereignis, non-availability, the moment of coming into its own, disappearing or withdrawing, and verwinden. And that's die Kehre. That's the turn. That's the turning. I address die Kehre extensively in my last or latest Heidegger course on the essence of technology. So die Kehre is not Heidegger turning away from a certain way of his own approach to something. It's how, if you like, being unfolds. So I think you've asked a question last time. AAAAF. Do you recommend me to study German, to read German philosophers, even though I'm not going to choose it as my path in academia? Well, I don't know what your situation is, whether you're a student or how I would always recommend if you're it doesn't matter what whether you're a student in philosophy or, but if there's a genuine interest that you have interesse, being with, that's what, or being in between, that's what interest means, if it means anything. Okay, so you're going to explore philosophy of science and Arabic philosophy. I mean, if so I don't recommend anything, but if the main focus for now is Arabic philosophy and you already know Arabic, then good. If not, then probably a good idea to learn at least some. It's always a good idea, I mean, especially when it comes to Greek also. It's a good idea to know some Greek, to be able to, there's a bit of Aristotle here, Plato, to be able to at least make out the words in the Greek, and be able to compare some of the translations, just to see this is what it says here and this is what it says in the Greek. And maybe you have a different view of something. And language, and it should be a requirement. I mean, really, if you're going on to do a PhD, and let's say it's in French philosophy, you're working on Derrida or Deleuze, and your mother tongue is Swedish or something, I think you should learn French to the degree that you can at least read, maybe not write, but read Derrida or Deleuze or the others. Simply because there's so much always lost in translation. Why? Again, because no language is perfectly translatable into another language. We can only ever approach it. So we approach the other language. And if you like, that's some sort of resistance even uh, to the machinations of Gestell. Um, and now George here is in a peculiar or special situation, which is that he's Greek and Swedish. So he's got he can read Swedenborg in Swedish if you so dare or desire. A spirit seer whose dreams can't burst, rightfully so. And George can read Homer. Um, and he can actually make it sound good, unlike me, because my pronunciation, of course, is no good. I was taught the German pronunciation of ancient Greek. But I can read ancient Greek. And what it allows me to do is to, when I read Plato, for example, or Aristotle, is that I see, especially, let's say, with Aristotle, in the metaphysics. I remember, and there's actually a video on this on my channel. If you type in Niederhauser Aristotle metaphysics, you should be able to find it, in which I address some of the issues of the standard translation that we find. And so, so in framing, if you think of in framing as this microphone or the camera or the computer that you're watching this on, or your phone that you're listening to this, but no, in framing is in a sense, or Gestell, that is in a sense making something, if you like, ready for easy consumption, if you like. Yeah. And a translation from the 19th century could be part of that already. You don't need electric light. You don't need spaceships for that. And framing is something deeper. It's a thetical manner. It's a manner that posits and makes readily available what isn't available. So I give you one example. Tito onenai, which I dare not translate in Aristotle. Maybe it means something like that which was being. But even that is at best a bad appropriation. So what I forgot the name of the translator in the Loeb Classics edition. Tito onenai simply becomes always formal cause. Always formal cause, regardless of context. In fact, sometimes the translation will go so far as to change the meaning of the entire paragraph just to make sure that here we have a formal cause again, so we can have our 4 Aristotelian causes. And now those of you who've read the question concerning technology by Heidegger, what does he refer to from the beginning? At the beginning, the 4 so-called 4 causes in Aristotle, reminding us there are no 4 causes in Aristotle. Aristotle himself, by the way, points out that of the idea, there may be more. The tradition turns this into set in stone, moral law, 4 causes. Learn them by rote. So, so in framing, Gestell operates here in these also beautiful classical translations of the text. That's where the danger resides, in these enframed translations that suffocate a text. Now, there's, for example, where's the book? Richard Hope, I think is his name. I should have it. I don't know. Yeah, here it is. So, yes, Richard Hope Aristotle's Metaphysics, and Aber paperbacks, and there are others. This is one that I have. There are other translations. Hope is adamant about trying to, look very closely at context. Um, on how to translate. Um, and that we cannot simply just always, you know, use the same translations at any given moment just to make sure that again we are constantly addressed by these texts, not because the texts speak to us, but because what we're being addressed by are the questions that we need to answer. These aren't abstract thoughts. These are the questions that make up, if you like, the universe. And so the attempt to have one language for all um, uh, is part of enframing. Um, so yeah, this comes highly recommended. Um, as does my book on Heidegger, of course, by the way, too. If you can get your hands on it. So if you're a student somewhere, I would recommend you get this through your university library, which is only going to enrich Springer even more, but it makes sure that the book at least gets read. Uh, yeah. So the the thinking path, in a sense, to paraphrase Kant a bit, the thinking path is that what is still open to us. Kant says that the critical path is still open to us. The thinking path is what's still is what's still open, and it is perhaps the most important achievement by Heidegger to have shown that we can read the so-called classics and don't think of them as classics at all without sterilizing them, but as running parallel to our time, and that again, nothing is monodirectional, nothing is deterministic, because there's constantly new dimensions bubbling up, new possibilities. So AA asks, "What's the name of your book? My friend might be writing her MA thesis on Heidegger. I'd like to recommend your book to her." So the book is published in English. It's called Heidegger on Death. I think this is mirrored here in the wrong way, but anyway, so the book is Heidegger on Death and Being. An Is not working. An answer to the Science-Frage, published by Springer in 2021. Again, Heidegger on Death and Being. Like maybe I just mentioned to you that if you head over to this website here, which is linked to in the description of this video, shows you all Heidegger courses bundled together into one. So you can also just take any of them individually. Heidegger on Being and Death, Being and Time Masterclass, on on enframing and the fourfold especially, and then the essence of technology, plus a bonus course on leisure with dignity, which includes a lecture on Heidegger's notion of Gelassenheit. So this brings it really together. All these threads that I've been following here today, and be great, pick it up, pick up either of them, or maybe all five of them, and go through Heidegger. Not to regurgitate Heidegger, it's always very important. What this should do is that it should spark in you the urge to see that, because what I find very fascinating is that so-called reactionaries, self-centered reactionaries, who are paid by God knows who online, um, uh, all they have to serve up is inevitable decline, or the Kali Yuga and all of this new agey nonsense. Um, Evola and blah 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 and Spengler and whoever else. And there's a reason why this is being made popular. Mm, because it's deterministic. It's actually the same story as left-wing progress. It's just the inverse of it. But they both proclaim inevitability. What to one is a utopia, to the other one, the same exact outcome would be dystopia. Now, the unpredictability of the world is what's crucial, and that it's never not monodirectional, sorry, but it's not one-dimensional. That, I think, is what we can learn from Heidegger. And that a lot has to do with a shift in seeing, a turning and overturning from within, so that you begin to see what is and address it then as such. And there is always, as Heidegger points out, a gigantic battle for the meaning of being and a a gigantic battle of old gods and new gods. So head over to the course website now and get the course bundle. 5 courses, which I think is rather exhaustive of Heidegger. So there's the 4 main pillars, if you like, of his thought are addressed abundantly. And especially when it comes to technology, etc., there's a tendency to try and look at it too ontically, if you like, in terms of technological advancement. Oh, Heidegger was against technology and all the other nonsense. No, that's not the point. The point is to try and understand and say what is. And also to establish a free relationship with technology, with techniques, which is what? Which is the way in which the world is being framed that is seemingly reductive. So, but it isn't. There's abundant richness still. Well, thank you very much for listening. Now head over to this website, to the Halcyon Academy, and get the bundle. Embark on the thinking path. So this is where it takes you. Scroll down and you're in. Thank you very much for listening. Share this with anyone interested in Heidegger or European philosophy, if you like, and anyone who is concerned with the philosophy of technology, etc. Thank you.